Hi, my name's Ray Poynter from VCU at Vision Critical, and I'd like to take you through an introduction to behavioural economics. So the agenda today: 1. The context for behavioural economics. Then I'm going to move on to some key themes. Then I want to look at the implications for market research. Then I'm going to make a few suggestions for some further reading, and then share with you my closing thoughts about the most important messages about behavioural economics in the context of market research. So, first of all, a bit of a myth buster. A lot of people, when they're talking about behavioural economics, will tell you that classical economics and all economists think about the econ, this rational consumer. Well, actually, that's never really been the case. If we go all the way back to the father of economics, Adam Smith, back in 1776, he published his book, The Wealth of Nations. Now, he didn't think that every individual behaved rationally. He only had to look around him to see that wasn't the case. What he did think, though, was that markets aggregated out as if people were working rationally, because one person being irrational one way would be balanced by somebody being irrational the other way, and that in the end an invisible hand would cause supply and demand to be matched together. So although he never thought that every individual was going to be rational, he did think that overall you'd end up with this rational market position. Now let's skip forward a few years to 1936. This man here, John Maynard Keynes, one of the most famous economists really of the last 100 years, and famous for Keynesian economics, for example. And in his book in 36, The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, he made the point that economies don't always fix themselves. There doesn't seem to be a hidden hand that pushes them back into the right situation. And he gave the example of wages, which tended not to go down in nominal terms. Workers would work very, very hard to protect the nominal, not the real value when you discount for inflation, but the nominal value of wages. These days we would call that loss aversion. So it's actually been around for quite a long time. And I think we can think of really the term behavioural economics as just a newish term for some older ideas. If we look at cognitive psychology and social psychology, we're going to see these things happening really on quite a long-term basis. Experimenters have looked at those places where we seem to do something that is predictably rational, and then they've looked at occasions where we do things that, to quote Dan Ariely, are predictably irrational. More recently, they've been joined by evolutionary psychology. And I think it's interesting to note that Daniel Kahneman won the Nobel Prize for Economics in 2002. Now, of course, when you win the Nobel Prize, it's for work you've been doing in the preceding years. It's not for work you did that year. So that pushes the history of behavioural economics back a bit further. But maybe it's interesting to think about why he got it in economics. First of all, there isn't a Nobel Prize in psychology, and secondly, the news that he was broadcasting and the information he was sharing were less surprising in psychology. They were more of a game changer for some parts of economics. So let's look at different aspects of what we're terming behavioural economics, and one of the best examples, I think, is from Guth, Schimbecker and Schwartz, and I do apologise for my pronunciation of the name, and they came up with the Ultimatum Game, and this game has now been repeated many, many times in different forms. But the basic idea of the game is you have two players. You give one of them a sum of money, let's say $10. That player has to decide how much to keep and how much to offer to the second player. If the second player accepts the offer, then they both walk away with the money. But if the second player rejects it, then neither of them get anything. And classical economics would suggest that the first player should say, well, I've got $10. If I offer him $1, he's better off than he would otherwise be. He should take that. So I'll offer him $1. Maybe I'll even offer him 50 cents. But that's not what happens in the test. Only about 20% of cases does the person with the money make a very low offer to the second person. What's more, in many of those cases, the second person then rejects it. So what is going on here? We have a breakdown in this rational consumer situation, and three different ideas have been suggested as possible reasons. The first is that the person making the offer knows what it feels like to be offered a bad deal. Writers such as Mark Earls have highlighted the role of so-called mirror neurons. It makes it harder for us to offer bad deals. The second is the person receiving the offer has to weigh the small monetary value of the offer against the disutility of feeling cheated. You're going to feel a bit stupid if you accept 50 cents, and 50 cents isn't worth anything very much anyway. You'd leave it as a tip most of the time, so you reject it. So all of a sudden there's two factors there, and then the third one, the sort of the rational side of those irrational factors, is the person making the offer has to weigh the risk that it will be rejected, because he can't simply assume that the other person will accept anything. Life experience tells him that that is not the case. So he now has to start thinking about at which level do I really think that this offer is going to be accepted. Taking this quote here from Daniel Kahneman, "We are to thinking as cats are to swimming. We can do it if we have to," because one of the things that the cognitive psychologists have really showed us, and has come through now in behavioural economics, is that most of the time we don't think hard and cognitively. We react. We have these things called heuristics. Heuristics are shortcuts. They give us a clue. So if you're living at home and you're living with perhaps your father, who's a man 6 feet tall, somebody you see at the corner of your eye, at about the time of day that your father comes home, somebody is coming in the room, and your brain is thinking, oh, that's probably Dad. You half glance and you see that it's somebody who is broadly 6 foot, broadly male. Yep, you start guessing really strong. Now I'm fairly sure it's Dad. You don't start off by saying, someone's coming through the door, do I think it's a person or an animal or a vehicle? Let's start looking at the person, do I think it's male or a female? We don't start off by doing a cognitive evaluation of what's happening. We start off by using heuristics, quick shortcuts to say, I bet it's going to be that, is it? I bet it's going to be that, is it? Much, much faster ways of processing, much, much lower load on the whole thinking process. Life would be simply too hard. We'd never get out of bed if we had to think every single step through. If you suddenly were lying there and thinking, now what's the relative merits of getting out of the bed on the left or getting out of the bed on the right, it could take a long time. So Daniel Kahneman suggested that it's useful to pretend that there are these things called System 1 and System 2. He doesn't claim they exist. In fact, he says that you won't find a home for them in the brain. They're metaphors, but they're really useful for thinking of two different ways of processing information. The first is System 1, which is this lightweight, really fast, low energy, heuristics based. So, make a disgust face when you're shown a horrible picture. You don't have to think, oh, I better look disgusted. It just happens. If I ask you what is 2 plus 2, you know the answer without having to do arithmetic. If you're driving a car on an empty road, this was quite scary. You actually drive a long way and realise afterwards that you weren't thinking very much. You were just doing. Detect that one object is more distant than another. That's quite complicated maths to do that, or we just apply our heuristics and we know that that's a cricket ball coming to us as opposed to a football, and we know that it's coming to us how quickly and how big is it and so on. If we're asked to complete the phrase bread and, then we can do that without having to think too hard. System 2 is when we do have to think hard. So if we're asked to focus on one person's voice in a crowded room, we actually have to work quite hard, and there's a cognitive load. Filling out a tax form, it can be quite exhausting to fill out a really long form with lots of information, because that's when we think about brain work being exhausting, when we're using System 2. If I just ask you to walk faster than you normally have to, you're going to have to think more about avoiding other people, about how your feet are going to hit the ground. It becomes System 2. Comparing two washing machines for overall value. It's one of the examples from Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, and of course it is right in the market research world. So if I ask you to pick your regular margarine, then in fact that's System 1. If I ask you to evaluate which of the two washing machines you're likely to pick, that's System 2. They will require different questions and formats and processing. If we ask in a room to look for a woman with white hair, you're going to employ System 2, unless it's your job to find women with white hair, by which time you would have developed heuristics, and it could well be System 1. This is a famous, or should I say an infamous example from Dan Narrowly, who has published lots and lots of experiments that he's conducted over the years into cognitive psychology, and we now call them into behavioural economics. And he was looking at the state of mind on ratings with this experiment. So he took two groups of male students and he gave one group a series of questions under normal circumstances. The second set were asked to watch, quotes, adult material and, quotes, self-stimulate themselves to be aroused and then answer the questions. Now these questions were both the same for both cells, and they were reported using a 0 to 100 scale. Amongst the results that were significant were, are women's shoes erotic? The control group scored that at 42. The aroused group at 65. Is a woman sexy when she's sweating? The control group scored that 56. The aroused group at 72. A little bit more worrying perhaps, is kissing just frustrating? The control group scored that at 41. The aroused group at 69. Would you keep trying to have sex after your date says no? The control group scored that really quite lowly at 20. The aroused group, more worryingly, up at 45. The most immediate implications from the research is that men who are perhaps quite reasonable when not aroused may be less reasonable when aroused. And I wonder what the results might have been if Arely had also created a cell that were aroused and had been drinking alcohol. What are the implications for market research? The question is whether asking decontextualized questions invalidates the results of the research. For example, can a fast food study capture the choices that people will make when they're in a restaurant experiencing hunger, smelling the food, and seeing other people order large meals with extra fries? Another great book in the area of behavioural economics is the book Nudge, which looks at the impact of the default and the power of inertia. And one of the really commonly quoted examples is between Germany and Austria and organ donation. Germany operates an opt-in model and has a donor rate of just 12%. Neighbouring and also German-speaking Austria has an opt-out system and the donor rate is 99%. So Germany, opt-in, 12% of people are donors. Austria, opt-out, 99% of people are donors. That's a tremendous inertia effect between the two. And it happens elsewhere. Another example that's often quoted is the US state of Illinois. When they changed from making the organ donor questions on license renewals optional to compulsory, donations jumped from 38% to 60%. They nearly doubled. Now, in Illinois, there was no opt-in or opt-out. The change was that drivers had to pick one of the options, a procedure often referred to as forced choice. They weren't saying that if you don't do this, then you'll be giving your donations. They simply had to tick one of the two boxes or they wouldn't get a driving license. Now, in market research, most of the time we have people making forced choices. They don't have to say no, they don't have to say yes, but they usually have to say something. So we need to think about the implications of forcing people to ask questions. Are we moving away from the inertia that has in the real world? What about the rating problem? Now this is really picked up from writing from Jonah Lehrer in his book How We Decide, and he talked about several experiments that showed how asking people to rate things altered their choices. For example, in one study, 2 cells of respondents were asked to choose which strawberry jam they preferred from a choice of jams. The first cell simply made their choices. They tasted them and picked one, and these choices turned out to be quite predictive of market-related assessments and expert opinions. The second cell were asked to fill out questionnaires about the jams they were testing. They were asked to look at the colour of them, how thick they were, how they looked on the spoon, various questions like that, and then to say which one they liked. What Lehrer reports is this second cell made worse predictions. Their choices did not reflect the marketplace. They didn't reflect expert opinions about which were the best tasting jams. Now, Lehrer posited that asking people to think too much about strawberry jam resulted in focusing on attributes that don't really matter. Kahneman would probably say the questionnaires were asking System 2 to do a job that in the real world is done by System 1. To what extent are market research questionnaires asking people to rate things that they should not be rating is the question that is raised at. Priming, anchoring and framing. Now these are talked about a lot in the context of behavioural economics, and in market research we've known about these for a long time and we've tried to tackle them. For example, if I ask you the question, how expensive do you think a business return flight from London to New York in May will be? And I then ask you this question, what would you expect to pay for an economy flight from London to Paris in May? Your answer to this second question will be higher than people who have not been asked the first question. If I expose you to a large number, and it can be something as simple as your social security number, then you will tend to come up with a higher estimate for almost anything else you're asked to estimate. If I expose you to a really small number, maybe the number of coins in your pocket, before I ask you a question about how expensive do you think a flight is going to be, then you are likely to come up with smaller numbers because we're primed to think in a particular way. Similarly, if I use these two scales on the left and the right to ask you what I think you're likely to pay for that economy flight in Europe, the scale on the left that starts earlier and starts to refer to more than at an earlier point will generate lower values in most cases than the right hand scale. So, what are the implications for market research? Well, I think there are two implications. The first of these is that we need to go back to basics. Market research is about applying psychological instruments in order to be able to measure things. We need to think about experimental design. We can't just do research. We need to think about why it would work that way, why it would be helpful, have we designed it properly. What we're looking for is a consistent relationship between responses and action. We're not looking for people to say exactly what they're going to do. We're looking for a method of being able to interpret what people say to predict what they're going to do. So, for example, if we've got some new concept testing and we find that 20% of people say they're going to buy this new product and 10% do, and for another product we're testing, 4% say they're going to buy it and 2% do, we can say that's fine. All we have to do is divide the predictions in half and we get the market estimates. Now, in fact, predictive models are a lot more complicated than that, but they're based on benchmarks and modelling. Nobody actually just listens to what the respondents are saying they're going to do and believes it. What we're looking for is a consistent relationship which allows us to benchmark and model the outcomes. And the second point that I'd make is that we need to focus on some key elements in market research. Context is an absolutely massively important thing. We need to think about system 1 or system 2. Is this a system 1 problem? In which case we simply want to show people some options and get them just to pick the one they're going to do. If it's a system 2, then we want to explore what steps would they take, how would they do that analytical process. So we have really quite different situations for system 1 and system 2. We need to think about whether the decision is personal or social. A lot of the time, if I were to ask many people at work what food were they going to eat that night when they went out with their friends and colleagues, they might give an estimate, but in fact they are likely to eat the same genre of food as the rest of their friends because they're probably going to go to the same restaurant. They don't know which restaurant it is. Once they get there, they're probably going to order food in the same price range as the people around them. You know, if everybody else is having fish and chips, you tend not to order the lobster thermidor with a nice expensive bottle of Chateau Lafite. It's just not done. We behave socially. So sometimes we need to be careful. Are we asking an individual to predict their behaviour when their behaviour is likely to be determined by social actions? So, some thoughts on some further reading. I would say these 3 books are probably essential for anybody in market research. The current bestseller, Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, very readable. Predictably Irrational by Dan Ariely. Now, I'm not really very happy with the title there because I don't think it is rational. I think irrational. I think that what is going on is that people are applying rules in a slightly different way. If we take loss aversion, it's simply that we value the loss 2 or 3 times as high as the gain. Once you put the right valuation in, it becomes a rational compensation structure in just the way you would expect it to. But nevertheless, great experiments reported there, very readable. And nudge, become adopted by many politicians. It's been used for many years by different sorts of marketing. This is the basis of lots of gym marketing where you're sold a subscription and of course you believe you are going to do it, but they know what's going to happen in the outcome. 4 more books that I think are really worth looking at. How We Decide, Jonah Lehrer. Switch by Chip and Dan Heath. Now, strictly speaking, this is a book about how to implement change in your life and in organizations, but actually it talks a lot about System 1 and System 2. It tends to refer to them as the elephant and the rider, and about cognitive processes. The Paradox of Choice by Barry Schwartz looks at a particular phenomenon. What happens when we give people more choices? They make worse decisions, they achieve less satisfaction. That's got an implication for market research. And finally, the new book by Mark Earls and others, I'll Have What She's Having, looking at how much we behave like herd animals, the importance of social in so much of what we do today. So, finally, just 4 thoughts about the market research world and things that you might want to take on board. Don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. Most market research works. It's been tested and it's been validated. Clients come back and they're buying more of it because they can see that the products they market research tend to be more successful than those that they don't. So let's not think that behavioural economics has turned everything upside down. The issues raised by behavioural economics are actually really good reasons to use professional researchers, and they highlight the risks for doing DIY research. DIY research very often assumes that what people tell us is what they mean. Professional researchers know that, first of all, you've got to design the questions very carefully, and secondly, you have to interpret the results correctly. And why do we know that? And what am I saying about not throwing out the baby with the bathwater? Well, we mustn't just use techniques we've used in the past. We need to look at those techniques and evaluate if some of them are actually not working or not working quite the way we want. And has that wording of a survey, does it now need changing? Has it grown out of date? Is it not actually optimized for the type of decision making that we think we're applying? And the single most important point that behavioural economics is raising is one that we've known 30, 40, 50 years, but we sometimes forget. Context is probably the most powerful of all these forces in shaping the survey. If we want to get the best information back from respondents, then we need to give them the best context for doing that survey. Now that might mean virtual reality, it might mean getting them to imagine that they're there, it might mean getting them to do various experiments and contextualizing things. It might be simply reminding them about the situation they've picked. Keep asking the questions in that context. All of these things will help. But we mustn't ever forget just how important context is. It's probably the thing that BE has helped us most in remembering. So, thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to questions.